You're listening to the N2K Space Network.
Hi, I'm Maria Varmazes, host of the T- Space Daily Podcast, and you're listening to T- Overview. In this program, we'll feature some of the conversations from our daily podcast with the people who are forging the path in the new space era. From industry leaders, technology experts and pioneers, to educators, policymakers, research organizations, and more. On today's program, we're going to focus on the infrastructure that is developing across the United States to support launches. Spaceports. Well, what is a spaceport? Well, the Federal Aviation Administration licenses them, but does not define what one is. And yes, there's a reason for that. And we'll be hearing more about it from Pam Underwood from the FAA Office of Spaceports. The first purpose-built commercial spaceport, Spaceport America, was built in New Mexico. We'll speak to Executive Director Scott McLaughlin about the economic impact of Spaceport America on the state of New Mexico. And where else in the U.S. is developing their own space launch facility? Among the many states looking at developing a site is up in vacation land. Yeah, Maine. We'll speak to Emily Dwinnells from the Maine Space Complex. Pam Underwood is the director at the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Spaceports in the Commercial Space Transportation Office. And I asked Pam what her office does.
Many people are familiar with the Federal Aviation Administration and what they do for the airline industry. Of course, we regulate the airline industry. We have air traffic controllers. We certify airplanes. We, manage pilot certificates. But what's little known is what the FAA also does for the commercial space transportation industry. And that's where we come in. My Office of Commercial Space Transportation, is responsible for regulating the safety of launch and reentry and the operation of spaceports or launch and reentry sites. That's the piece that most people don't know. It's been really exciting. I've actually been with the office for a little over 17 years. And to see the growth in the commercial space transportation industry is just exciting. We don't regulate launches that are by and for the government. So when NASA was flying the shuttle program, that was by NASA for NASA, because that was a NASA purpose. We did not regulate that. But now that government agencies are using commercial industry, we regulate those activities. For example, now that NASA is using the commercial companies to do resupply of cargo and crew to the International Space Station, all of those missions are 100% licensed by the FAA because it is actually a commercial company that's conducting the launch, making those safety decisions. They're the ones that design and operate the vehicles. So therefore, it requires oversight from the federal government, which is where the FAA comes in. In those cases, the government, NASA in this case, is only buying services. So it really allows them to use their program dollars more wisely and not have to own and operate vehicles. And it helps be the success of the commercial industry. So we regulate the commercial industry, but please know that does include sometimes government is a customer.
So spaceport licensing, let's move on to that topic. So many questions I can ask. So do we need more spaceports in America?
That's a great question. And I get that question all the time. So some people may not know, but we actually have 14 FAA licensed spaceports around the country. They're all over the place. Not only they're in Florida, we've got them in Virginia, Colorado, Oklahoma, California, Texas, New Mexico. They're all over the place. We're very rich when it comes to spaceport infrastructure. We're very fortunate in this country to have it. So what I often get is, why do we need any more? Isn't that enough? Well, how many airports do we have? Did anyone judge the number of airports? No. I mean, it's really a matter of convenience based on where people wanted to go. And it's the same thing for space. There's a little bit more physics involved because you have to consider trajectories and where you want to be on orbit, if you're going to orbital, suborbital, the types of vehicles you're flying, but it's still the same. We shouldn't look at the number necessarily of spaceports. We should look at the capabilities. What does our industry need? What do we need? And if it's options so that they can have more capability for their customers, then that's what we should have. So it should be capability driven rather than just chasing a number. Because otherwise someone could say, I don't know, 5's enough, or 20 is enough, or 50. I mean, pick the number. It's kind of a bit arbitrary. Let's look at the capabilities, which is kind of what they do on the airport's perspective. You know, if I want to get to these parts of the country, then I need to have airports in those locations.
That's a great answer to an admittedly overly simple question. So thank you. I appreciate that. If I understand correctly, there are different types of spaceports. It's not just like it's a spaceport and it's just this one thing. There are different kinds. Can you walk me through what that means?
Absolutely. So we have different spaceports grow up depending on the types of customers they're trying to serve and the locations where they're at. This goes back to the physics question because not all places are really suitable for different kinds of launches. So right now we have horizontal launches, meaning they take off like an airplane and they land typically like an airplane, or we have vertical launches. That's what I think people see more of. Last year alone, our launch rates, 92% of our launches were vertical. So that's where the pointy end goes up and the flames come out the bottom. That's a vertical launch. That's the vertical launch. The horizontal launch is a little different. They take off and land like airplanes, and they usually use a runway. So that's where the different types of spaceports come in. All the 14 FAA licensed spaceports that I talked about before have specific features. 5 of them are vertical, the rest of them are horizontal. And so therefore they'd satisfy different launch vehicle companies depending on the type of vehicle they're operating. But then there's other things that spaceports need too. So many people focus on just the launch. But if you look at the ecosystem that is a spaceport, they have to support a lot more than just a launch day. So many things have to happen in order to lead up that launch. Think about all the testing or manufacturing that has to come in order to enable that launch, or the instrumentation checkouts or builds that they have to have. The spaceport has to have all of that infrastructure to be able to support those preparatory activities in addition to just the launch. So that goes into the capabilities as well. Can you test your engines from that site and then go down the road and then actually conduct a launch? Or do you have to test your engine someplace else and then go to a different place to launch? That's the things that the space companies need to put together when they're looking at the capability of the spaceports.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The FAA does not define what a spaceport is. Is that true? And if
That's
so,
true.
why? Yeah.
So what's actually defined in regulation is launch or reentry site. That is actually the regulatory term. We call them spaceports because it's a generic term that refers to both. It's both a launch and reentry site. Now, I will tell you, in 2018, Congress, in the FAA Reauthorization Act, did define what a spaceport is. But that's in a reauthorization act. It's not really regulations because we didn't flow it down into our regulations yet. But there's starting to go in that direction. But it's not defined. Like I said, officially, they're either a launch or a reentry site.
Does it cause problems that it's not defined? I mean, is it not a big deal, or is it just a matter of nomenclature? I mean, is it a...
So I don't think it causes problems, but maybe that's just me. I might be one of those people too close to the problem, for sure. To me, it's kind of like slang. So rather than calling it the proper name of launch or reentry site, we've called it spaceport, which has kind of been what we would generally call slang in the industry. So it hasn't caused problems from a regulatory perspective because they will either get a launch site operator license or a reentry site operator license from the FAA. And once they have those, for example, you could go on the FAA launch website now and you'll see a map and it says spaceports. So we actually call it it's on our map. So we even use it kind of as a generic term, but the proper name really is launch or reentry site.
So we've been talking about different kinds of spaceports. How does one license spaceports?
Yeah, so the spaceports have requirements that they have to meet. So you have to fill out an application. And it's not like an application to get a driver's license that's like a page long. You're talking volumes and volumes of data. And primarily, spaceports have to meet things such as control of public access. because more than likely they're going to have activities or maybe certain commodities on site that they would or might be hazardous to people. So you have to control people, keep people from getting into places they could get hurt. So control of public access is part of it. You also have to consider environmental assessment and impacts. Based on the kind of vehicles you want to host there, what could be the environmental implications from that? So they'll have to undertake an environmental review. They'll also do something called a launch site safety assessment, which will take a look at the operations they propose and whether or not they could be done there safely, meeting FAA safety requirements. So they will really kind of do a feasibility study, if you want to call it, to demonstrate to the FAA that what they want to host there can be done and meet safety. So there's quite a bit of information that has to be provided to the FAA to be able to show compliance with the regulations. If they show compliance, then they get a launch license. If they don't, then the FAA will work with them to see if there's other ways they could meet it. But it's a very stringent process for sure. And we always lead with safety in the FAA.
Our second guest is Executive Director of New Mexico's Spaceport America. Scott McLaughlin talks us through the economic impact that the spaceport has had in the state.
Well, sure. The report is only for 2022, so it's just a one-year estimate of economic impact. And a lot of people say that economic impact is always positive, meaning if you do something, you always kind of get something out of it. So it's hard to gauge. What is the correct amount that you'd expect at this time? But what it shows on the summary is what it shows is we have about 811 jobs that are from the spaceport's existence. That includes what are called direct, indirect, and induced. And then the total value added is about 60 million, and that's kind of the raw input into the economy. And then there's another number about double that, which is sort of the money that gets reused. But the 60 million is really kind of the big thing that we want to focus on in the jobs.
Sure. Okay. So that you said, I'm going to see if I remember, direct, indirect, and then induced, if I remember.
Right. Well, in economic terms, direct are the jobs that are directly connected with the economic activity, whatever it is. So if you build a McDonald's, the people who are working for McDonald's are the direct employees. So they're the ones directly working for them. Induced has to do with the people who show up and work on the ice coolers and the air conditioner and maybe pave the parking lot. And then that was the indirect. And then the induced are, for example, now that you have employees in the area, they have to go shopping. So you eventually have to hire some extra full-time equivalents at the grocery store. Some of these are direct numbers. Like the direct value is measured directly from Virgin Galactic, our primary customer at the spaceport, not our only customer, but our primary one. And then the other ones are estimated through something called IMPLAN, which is a commonly used model that tries to model economic impact. So a very interesting study. It was done by New Mexico State University, part of their Center for Border Economic Development. And so we had some real PhD economic economists who worked on this. And so we're going to try and do one every year.
And I'm curious, for you, I mean, the numbers, I mean, I don't have any sense of, those sound like big numbers to me, about as much as my understanding goes. But I mean, in terms of what it means for you at Spaceport America, like when you saw the report, did that crystallize something in your mind? Like, oh yeah, that's what, we sort of had a sense of this, but now we know we have a number to attach to it. What was that takeaway for you?
Well, there were two things. One is I was doing as an electrical engineer turned business person, I was doing back of the envelope calculations on economic impact. So it was actually good to see that my estimates through my reading on economic impacts were pretty close. And that was the first thing. And the second thing was, thank goodness that we have that kind of impact. But this is just for 2022. It's not a cumulative thing. But what it shows is that we're having significant activity, in the region. But I look at it as a cautionary tale because the spaceport was dreamed about in the 90s after the Ansari X Prize and Scaled Composites won it. And then our governor, Richardson, may he rest in peace. He just died, but he made a deal with Sir Richard Branson in 2004, 2005. And then the spaceport, began to be built in 2006. We had to get an FAA license. We had to get the New Mexico Spaceport Authority had to be created by the legislature. I work for the state of New Mexico. So, our economic impact is good. I'm very happy with it, but it's a cautionary tale to all of those people all around the world who are working on building commercial spaceports that this is not easy. You got to have the right set of ingredients, and you better have some patience too, because it takes a while. As we know, space is hard. And then I said the other day, spaceporting is hard. It's hard to do this. And so these are good numbers, but a lot of people would say in the state that, well, we've waited, almost 20 years for those good numbers, so they better be good. In the meantime, there's an opportunity cost with that money. That money that the state of New Mexico spent could have been spent on something else, and there could have been a benefit. So it's good numbers, but like I said, a cautionary tale.
You mentioned one of your customers, so that's Virgin Galactic, very famously launching from Spaceport America. And now they're picking up the cadence this year. So next year's report is going to be really interesting after all this increased cadence from Virgin Galactic. So I'd be very curious to hear about how your customer, Virgin Galactic, is their increasing flight cadence, how that's affecting Spaceport America, and maybe how operations might be changing. Walk us through that. Yeah.
No, we expect a lot more impact because of their monthly activities. And of course, what they've said is in 2025, 2026, they expect to be delivering the Delta class version of spaceships, which will hopefully increase their cadence to more than once a month. We'll start talking once a week, for example. So in 2 or 3 years, we can talk about real impact. Of course, we have other customers that come and go at the spaceport. Some are there for months at a time. Some are there for weeks at a time. So we also count that impact. And then even the Spaceport America Cup, which is once a year, a very large event, we count that impact too. But part of, we're trying to do with the spaceport is we got the jobs and we've got we now have some direct impact, but we're also focused on this idea of building an aerospace ecosystem in the area, which is something we've started to call Space Valley. I don't know if you've heard about that.
A little bit, yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about that? That's a really interesting idea, yeah.
What I'm realizing now is that people that studied whether a spaceport could be in New Mexico in the 90s, they weren't just focused on putting in a spaceport. They were focused on creating a keystone-type activity in the state that could build the whole aerospace ecosystem. And that, by the way, is part of the cautionary tale, because if you look at some of the other spaceports that are being proposed, or even some that are being built right now in the country and around the world, they really don't have the opportunity for a complete aerospace ecosystem. They're going to be able to do launch, and they're going to have some businesses that might form around the spaceport. But what makes New Mexico unique is, from Los Alamos to El Paso, as I've been saying, we've got great universities. We've got aerospace activities from the federal government in several different places, the Air Force Research Lab, the DOE laboratories, Los Alamos and Sandia, White Sands Missile Range. And so you add in the spaceport, and what you have now is a place where you can launch vertically, horizontally, and eventually come back down to Earth, because we're working on our FAA reentry license right now. So this economic impact is really cool, but I'm really hoping it will be, talk to me in 5 years and 5 or 10 years, and we'll see something really spectacular, I think.
It's going to be interesting. It's a very interesting time right now. I'm really excited and interested in seeing what's happening. And I'm just curious, as you look ahead to the future, any thoughts on, as you said, in 5 years, when we get back to you on what's going on, like what do you think Spaceport America is going to look like 5 years from now?
Well, we're definitely focused on some of the possible launch systems that could launch orbitally from Spaceport America. And so, there's something like 4 or 5 or 6 private space stations being worked on right now. And of course, we're going back to the moon. There's a lot more space tourism that could happen in space. People are talking about mining in space. And as I mentioned, we're working on a reentry license. So, potentially a capsule or the Sierra Space Dream Chaser vehicle might be able to come back to Spaceport America. So if you kind of fast forward a little bit and you look at what could be happening in space, you're talking about having to bring a lot of people and a lot of cargo up into space and to bring a lot of stuff home. So there's a lot of pressure on the Eastern Range, the Cape Canaveral, to do all that work right now. And of course, they have one major customer, SpaceX, who got there first and is doing a great job, and they're able to come and they're take off and they're able to land. Well, at some point, there's going to be, many more launch providers that need to do the same thing. So the Spaceport America, we think, is well positioned that when they design a vehicle that's safe enough, that you could launch and land at Spaceport America. And something's going to have to give, because the amount of cargo, again, that's going to have to go to space over the next 10 years is kind of phenomenal.
Our third guest today is Emily Dwinnells, Director of the Maine Spaceport Initiative. I asked Emily what's being envisioned in Maine.
So the Maine Space Complex is this moonshot that came to bear a couple of years ago. We're looking at the Maine Space Grant Consortium, which is a NASA-funded 501c3 that exists in every state. I was really thinking about the investments they had been making in the state and realizing that they'd been doing some really high-level, really important research, but they hadn't necessarily been getting an ROI on the research. People who were doing it weren't sticking around. There was no space industry in the state. And so it started Dr. Terry Shahada kind of thinking about how could we change this? And so we got together a handful of 17 people from the space industry within Maine, and they just spitballed ideas. And what they came up with was this concept of a Maine Space Complex. It had, several other names before that, but that's sort of the latest iteration. And what the complex is really meant to do is to take advantage of Maine's natural geographic location, which is actually a competitive advantage for launch because it hangs out over the eastern seaboard and is an excellent place to launch into polar orbit. So identifying this as a sort of strategic advantage, they decided to move the sort of inquiry forward, which is when I came on board and started developing the Maine Space Complex. So the Maine Space Complex, to answer your question, is a three-legged stool, and it's focused on launch services, so the establishment of a spaceport in Maine. The second piece is data and analytics. So it's taking whatever's downlinking from space, from the satellites, and making a service or productizing that data. And then the third piece is an innovation hub. So it would be focused on R&D to spin up more in-state space industry.
So can you tell me a little bit about the history of how this started, where you're at the moment, and what the next steps are for the program?
We really kicked this off in 2017. Is when the idea started percolating. And then I got involved in 2019, which was the initial feasibility study. So if we build it, will they come? And I was really reaching out to in industry and saying, what are you experiencing in launch? Is there a backlog? Is there a need? Do we have demand? What does this look like? And where's the industry going? And so we sort of worked through the stage gate process. That was conclusive. There was demand. So we progressed to the next stage, which was the business implementation planning, where we sort of formulated and fleshed out all of the business units, the organizational structure, the operating model for the spaceport, and then moved on to the strategic planning piece, where we got our short, mid, and near far-term objectives outlined. And from there, today, what we're doing is looking sort of into the future of space. What is the future of space going to look like? And how do we develop a workforce that will be equipped to enter and contribute out of the gates? So in the current moment with regard to the space complex, we have just passed legislation in the state of Maine to create a private-public partnership called the Maine Space Corporation. And so the corporation is actually just being instantiated. They were sworn in this past week, and they will be taking over at the helm to drive forward the strategic plan.
Nice. That's what really leads into my next question. Who's funding the idea behind having a space complex in Maine?
So the funding that we've received so far just to do the initial studies has come from two different bodies. So the first one is the Department of Commerce, and they have contributed some to the last two phases. We also have an in-state sort of risk capital organization called Maine Technology Institute. They've also contributed some funding, as well as the Maine Space Grant Consortium.
And what's the reaction been like generally from the public in Maine?
It's interesting because, initially out of the gates, it wasn't very public facing. So most of the reaction we've gotten, by and large, has been extremely positive. It's been very supportive. People are like, their minds are blown. They're very excited about it. But as you say, anything to do with space has to be implemented in a very safe and sustainable way. And because of Maine's ethos, we want the spaceport spaceport to represent that, space complex to represent that. So sustainability is actually a really important piece of the way that we will go forward to develop and ultimately operate under that value. When we went through the bill signing process to initiate and establish the corporation, we started to get some interest from some dissenters. So we began to see, I think one of the things that was really interesting to me, something that I completely would never have guessed, is that there were a lot of anti-nuclear protesters that came out of sort of the woodwork to push back on the legislation. And I think it sort of highlighted this fact that, space has really evolved since the 1960s and 70s, sort of where, most of these people kind of got their grounding and developed their philosophy around the anti-nuke stance. And while, there's certainly potential for it to be part of the future of space, it's not as much a military government operation as it once was. Obviously now, today, it's very much commercially focused. Yes, the government is still a big piece of it, but there's concerns about the government-military complex taking over when really the entirety of our sort of focus right now is on the commercial sector. So there's a lot of misinformation and misinterpretation, some conspiracy around who ultimately will own this. But we have just started sort of reaching out and engaging with the environmental groups, which is another big piece of that. Obviously, as you know, doing an environmental assessment is a big piece. And one of the first pieces of establishing a spaceport is a quite lengthy and pretty in-depth process. So we're not at that stage yet. We're still getting the plans and the location locked down. So we haven't crossed that bridge yet, but we're about to start engaging with the communities in northern Maine that could potentially be homes or sites for the spaceport.
I feel like we barely scratched the surface when it comes to spaceports and how their roles are going to impact society in the coming years. Our sincere thanks to our guests Pam Underwood, Scott McLaughlin, and Emily Dwinnells. If you're interested in hearing more about the space industry, join me every day for T- Space Daily. It's available on all major podcast platforms. You can find out more at space.n2k.com. We'd love to know what you think of this show. You can email us at space@n2k.com. Your feedback ensures that we deliver the information that keeps you a step ahead in the rapidly changing space industry. This episode was produced by Alice Carruth, mixing by Elliot Peltzman and Trey Hester, with original music and sound design by Elliot Peltzman. Our executive producer is Brandon Karpf. And I'm your host, Maria Varmazis. Thanks for listening.